I'm Indy Nidell, and this is The Great War on the Road. Now, we are in England once again at the Tank Museum, Bovington. We were here last year to shoot some specials, and with me, as he was last year, is the curator and head honcho, David Willey. David, say hello to everybody out there.
Hello again.
Now, if you think that being the curator of the Tank Museum means that you know a lot about tanks, you are absolutely correct, because when I say we are going to talk about certain things today, it's mostly he who's going to talk about them. We're standing in front, actually, of a medium Whippet tank, a British tank from the First World War, and you're going to tell us all about this, right? Now, it was not officially called the Whippet, right?
No.
What was it officially called?
It's a medium Mark A tank, and it's the first tank, what we call a lighter tank, a faster tank that the British put into service.
Now, I have to ask you, because I was asked to ask you, but it's a good question because it might not be so intuitive to people at home, which actually was the front end of this tank when we walk around.
So as we're looking at it, we're facing the front. The barbette, that taller bit at the back there, that's where the crew are, engines in front, and under here is actually the petrol tank, and it would be driving in this direction.
And we'll see that when we go around it. Now, before we talk about its specifications and attributes and armaments and its service history, I'm going to ask you some questions, and then you can lecture me and lecture us on this. Okay, why a medium tank? Who came up with it? When did they come up with it? And how was the process of creation?
So the idea behind this is, even as they're inventing that very first tank, we've had a look before at Little Willie, we've had a look at the Mark I tank, the rhomboid-shaped tanks.
Yep.
Chap called Sir William Tritton, he's just been knighted for his work on the first very beginning tanks. He works for Foster's of Lincoln. He thinks that yes, we need a big tank to crush down the wire, lead through no man's land, let the infantry follow. But right at the beginning, he says, why don't we make also a faster tank to then follow on and go through the gap?
Clever.
Now, traditionally, that's the role of the cavalry, what we call the arm of exploitation in the First World War. Cavalry is supposed to go through that gap, do all the damage.
Yep.
Now, Tritton comes up with the idea of this medium tank, they call it. It's not a heavy tank, it's about 8 tons.
And the heavy tanks were how much?
About 30 tons you're looking at here. So he's looking at this vehicle to say, we need something that's going to be faster. The rhomboid tank's about 3.5 miles an hour with the wind behind you. They want something that they think's about double that, and the Whippet ends
something like a running man.
It is, about 8 miles an hour they're looking for. Now the issue is they've got such big production problems with the very first rhomboid tanks, they don't get really going on this, the medium A, until about a year later.
And so when did he come up with the idea? And when did
so he's actually coming up with the idea at the end of 1916, he first thinks of this. We don't actually see the Whippet tank come out the factories until the beginning of really 1918, and they're only there from about March of 1918 in the front lines. The idea behind it, as I say, it's to go through the gaps, and of course in the summer of 1918, when we're looking at things like the Amiens offensive, that's its moment to be able to, because the front lines start breaking down and we have an opportunity.
A war of motion once again.
Exactly, we've got mobility back on the battlefield, so that's where the Whippet has its moment.
Okay.
We can have a wander around. Do you want to have a look at this fellow?
Okay.
So just seeing how the Whippet actually looks, what you've got here in the front is 2 what are called Tyler engines. And it's a slightly odd way of driving it, because when you drive this, the driver's in that cab at the back there.
It's a single driver, right?
One driver.
And that's different from
8 men, 4 men driving in the Mark IV tank, for example.
Single driver.
So one guy's in there, he's driving, and what he does is he speeds up by turning a steering wheel. It actually increases the throttle on one of the engines.
Okay, so this goes faster, so it turns.
Exactly, so you speed up the track on one side, that makes that side go faster, so you turn around the engine. And if you do it too fast in the wrong way, you can stall the engines, you can suddenly find yourself in a bit of a spin. So that is one of the problems of actually, you need to be a fairly skilled guy to get the best out of a
It's like driving 2
Whippet.
cars at once.
It is, 2 engines, speed up one side, that track goes, speed up the other side goes. We put the fuel tank on the front, it's in an armoured box there, so it's away from the crew. Another issue though is quite often, because they are looking for exploitation roles, they always might want to go a little bit further. They often put extra petrol tanks on the roof, extra petrol tanks on the rear, little jerry cans, almost
bombs.
Equivalent from the, and of course if you are hit, there's always a problem that you might end up having fuel running into the hot engine pipes,
So,
etc.
but let's say that you got hit and fuel leaked in. Would this be a problem with like asphyxiation or something like that?
I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. Let's
Okay.
tell what the other crews are up to. So we've got a driver in there. We've also got 2 other crew members. You'll have a gunner, and they'd normally fit this with 4 Hotchkiss 303 machine guns on those little ball mounts.
Yeah.
You've got a commander who's obviously in charge of everything, and sometimes they'd even try and squeeze a 4th crew member in there. Now, if we go round the back, we can have a look as we're going past. Tracks obviously lower, but the length of them means it can still cross pretty big wide trenches, shell holes, etc. As the mud is picked up as it's going over the soft ground, that should be able to fall away.
That's great. That's
Just down the side there, and you'll
That's
see that
new,
on.
right?
It is a new invention, and you'll see it on Second World War tanks, all sorts of vehicles as well. But as you work your way round, you can see through as you come round to the back here.
All right.
This is the door that lets you in the cab,
Right.
and those 3 men, when you look in that space, it is not very big. The floor's rotted out here. You'd actually had a wooden floor. And again, that will be piled up with ammunition boxes, extra fuel, maybe a carrier pigeons as well, things to be able to communicate with.
Like the gunner, is it the one gunner is doing all 4 guns, or is the
Which is
the
the
captain?
commander. The
Yeah.
commander will jump in as well
Okay.
and maybe man some of those weapons. Hence the idea of a 4th crew member as well, because
All right.
again, if you've done that exploitation role, the enemy might be all around you. So this idea of being able to use weapon systems that face everywhere.
This
They-
one seems to only have 3 guns though.
It
So I'm
has at the
wondering-
moment, and again, we haven't put one on here on the back where we've
back.
opened the door as well, so you can fire rearwards. But the idea behind it, again, if you're going through the enemy front line, that sense of exploiting the gap, what they do for the Battle of Amiens is they try and pair up these Whippet tanks, as they're then being called. The guys call it a Whippet, fast
the
dog.
dog, yeah.
Exactly 8 miles an hour, you're going fast in this. So they pair them up with the cavalry, and they have problems. Because what the problem is the cavalry, when there aren't any machine guns around or enemy soldiers, are brilliant for going forward very quickly. When they meet the enemy machine guns, it's then got the problem of having to wait for the Whippet to catch up. So after the Battle of Amiens, they then start saying, hang on a second, no point trying to combine these 2 things, let them do their work separately in how to exploit the gaps that the bigger tanks are making. And with the Battle of Amiens as well, you've got to give the moment to the cavalry. This is the moment the genuine horse cavalry have an opportunity. Finally to get through, and they are running down retreating German soldiers on horseback, so they have that moment there. And these fellows as well, Whippet tanks going forward, and I said I'd tell you a great story about one. There's one of these Whippet tanks on August the 8th, break through the front line. It goes on a complete rampage behind the German, by itself, shoots up a column, ends up, there's German soldiers arriving to reinforce this breakthrough. It shoots up a train, it knocks down a barrage balloon. It just has an amazing experiences doing almost a boy's own story. Till finally the petrol tanks that were carried on the top are pierced, the petrol runs down, the fumes inside catch fire, and the guys catch fire. There's 3 guys inside this vehicle, their uniforms catch fire, they have to roll out the back. One of those, the driver is killed instantly. 2 of the other guys, the commander, a guy called Arnold, he ends up being beaten up by some very cheesed off German soldiers.
I can imagine they're not being chuffed about this.
Exactly, they've been stalking this vehicle for some time. He ends up being rescued by a German officer called von Maritz. And what happens...
Von Maritz the general?
No, this is a German lieutenant, comes over and he says, hang on chaps, these guys were only doing their job. And as a thank you, Arnold gives him his wristwatch as a thank you for rescuing him and the driver, or sorry, the second, the gunner who's in there, a guy called Ribbons. Now those 2 guys end up going into prisoner of war camp. This amazing story about their tank called Musical Box is not known until after they're released from the prisoner of war camp. And then they get decorated for this amazing action they go through. And amazingly, the German officer and the British captain, Arnold, they meet up after the war on a couple of occasions, and we've got pictures of them meeting in the 1930s, and von Maritz actually gives him back this wristwatch as a thank you. We've got that in one of the cases here.
Now, what happened to their Whippet? I mean...
That Whippet was actually captured by the German. There's a photograph of it. The Germans use it actually as a first aid point. They're rallying wounded soldiers there. This tank called Musical Box. Later on, as the British advance, it's actually captured back by the British forces. We just don't know the story behind it until we've actually got a chance after the First World War to talk to the crew when they're released. So that's only then that it appears in the war diaries.
There must be a lot more of these that we don't even know, since maybe the crews were killed. So what kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of production, and how many saw service?
So we're not looking at the same sort of scale as with things like the Mark IV, where they built over 1,000 of them. Here, with the Whippet, we've only got a couple of hundred vehicles are being delivered in time, but they've already come up with a better design. And Fuller, the chief of staff...
This is by the end of the war? Or?
This is by the end of November of 1918.
Okay.
But they're already doing this planning for what they hope to be this massive attack in 1919. We've got to remember that the high command, the politicians, they're saying, right, 1919 will be the year. That is when we're going to win. And they've started designing a vehicle called the Medium D tank.
Okay.
That's going to have a longer range, will be faster, more firepower on it, and that's what they hope will replace the Whippet. As we've all got the benefit of hindsight, we know Haig, he's pushing this idea, let's try and finish the war in 18 before the Americans get the credit, etc. And therefore we don't see that use of what would be the successor vehicles, the Medium D, and all these other specialist vehicles they're starting to design ready for the following year.
But they did continue production of those. They didn't stop production because the war ended, did
they? They do. They pretty much at the end of the, there's a couple of vehicles end up being made for experimentation purposes to trial, and they go on into the 1920s. But pretty much at the end of the war, that's it. Because we are all so relieved
that the war
and you know, putting it bluntly, it's a bankrupt country now. You know, we're at that point, the last thing we want to be doing is spending more money on machinery that hasn't necessarily got a use. The Whippets, though, some are sold on, some go to the Far East, some are used in Russia, so we're British forces
fighting the Civil War and
the White Russians fighting against the Reds, and one or two are actually used in Northern Ireland. The idea you turn up with a tank, it tends to have that impressive power issue, so they're used almost like, not quite for crowd suppression, but for intimidation. And again, that's the beginning of that other story as well, which is how do we use armoured vehicles to look big and beefy when we're a government? And that's always sensitive. Track vehicles looks a bit aggressive. Wheeled vehicles we kind of get away with. That's been the history there. If we just carry on round here, we can have a look round this side. One of the other things that 1918, because the Germans had captured so many British tanks at Cambrai, they also captured some Whippets at Amiens. We paint these stripes on our vehicles, and that's a classic symbol of those late war battles.
Just though these are ours. These are
exactly
not Panzer.
That. And they quite often paint those stripes on the roof of the vehicle as well, so the Flying Corps going over, or now the RAF, would be able to identify as one of theirs. So think the planes for the D-Day landings, those white stripes painted literally the night before almost in some cases on there. This one, it's making sure, because again, we have that huge issue right in the First World War, recognition, friend or foe. Is that one of ours, or is it one captured by the enemy? And that issue, like so many of these things we can see in World War I, it's true right the way through armoured warfare history. Just that worry about if we knock out our own one, is it better? Let's make it plain for the troops. This is something different.
This is us. Now, I see all the ventilation here. Compared to, say, the Mark I or the Mark IV, is this much better ventilated, or is it still just horrible in there?
If you're the tank crewman, one of the problems is the heat is being drawn through the cab at the back there. So if you read all the accounts, this idea about potentially 4 guys in there, they hate it. It is, the door will be open to the last possible moment as they're going into action. Claustrophobic, ridiculously hot. You've
don't
got
wear
fumes.
The armor they're supposed to.
Absolutely terrible conditions, crew conditions. This is before the health and safety days. So from their point of view, that sense of trying to get out of that vehicle as soon as possible, just like if you see a lot of still photographs of the Rhomboid tanks, these ones, unless you have to be in the cab, you will be hanging on the back or on the roof or sitting on the front. You don't want to be in there unless you have to.
I noticed that, okay, you've got the little view slits, and I see there's some fake ones painted there. I suppose that's so the enemy fires on those.
Just simple ideas. So snipers going for the viewing ports. Actually, why don't we do dummy viewing ports there, so painted on?
That's great.
And again, these simple ideas are there right at the beginning. We're still doing dummy things like that on vehicles today, deception. How can we stop the enemy getting one over on us? Now this particular vehicle, this one we know its story. This is used by a young Second Lieutenant Sewell. He's in an attack in August of 1918.
Right.
There's a number of Whippets going forward in support of some Australian troops. What happens is one of them turns over and gets stuck in a shell hole. Sewell in this tank sees what's going on and he runs across to the tank that has actually got stuck, and he digs out the rear door, levers open the rear door and rescues the crew because that tank's caught fire. And he grabs the crew out. By this time, his own driver has left this vehicle and has been shot by the enemy. Sewell runs back to him, is dressing his wounds, and sadly both of them then get hit by machine gun fire from the enemy.
But they did rescue the other.
They rescued that, and Lieutenant Sewell, he's awarded one of the first Victoria Crosses that's actually awarded to a tank crewman.
Tank crew member.
Because basically in the First World War, if you're in a tank, you don't tend to get seen what you're doing. All 4 Victoria Crosses that are awarded to tank crewmen in World War I, their actions are outside the tank where they can be seen by others.
Okay.
And this is his tank. It was then brought back as what they called a memorial tank. Used to sit outside here at Bovington, and obviously huge important value. It's great that we know that story behind it, and we've actually got his Victoria Cross.
Well, it's good to make these stories. I mean, you can see the tanks and think, oh, big, impressive, cool, evil, whatever you want to say, but to have personal stories to see.
And for me, that's what brings them alive. You know, genuinely, ping, can you hear that story that vehicle's got to tell? That's the one for me about, you know, what were the men like inside it? What were they up to? This technology, fantastic stuff, all doing that way. It's about the men that I still think that's what grabs us all and gets our interest going.
Well, David, thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
And don't worry about missing him too much, because you will see him in other specials. If you'd like to see our episode about the adolescent and developmental years of the tank, you can click right here for that. And you can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.